The house was called Wynford, and it was the grandest place Catherine Mercer had ever been engaged to work in. And from the moment the hired chaise turned in at the gates, she felt a strange unease settle over her that she could not name and did not like, for Catherine Mercer was not a fanciful woman. She had had every scrap of fancy worn out of her years ago by grief and by work and by the hard plain business of earning her bread. And she distrusted feelings she could not account for, but there it was. As the chaise rolled up the long avenue under the bare February trees, and the great gray house came into view at the end of it, candlelight already showing gold in a dozen tall windows against the early winter dark, Catherine felt the unease deepen into something almost like recognition, as though she had been here before, which was impossible, for she had never in her life been within 50 miles of this county. She put it down to tiredness. She had been traveling since dawn, and she was always low in February, for February was the month her brother had died. 5 years, gone now, in a city far across the sea. And a tired woman in a sad month is prone to fancies, and the cure for fancies is work, and there would, she did not doubt, be a great deal of work. For she had been engaged to nurse the dowager Duchess of Wynford, who was old and frail and failing, though not, the agency's letter had been careful to say, in any immediate danger. The dowager required a skilled and gentle and genteel attendant, a gentlewoman by birth who could nurse with both competence and tact. And would Miss Mercer, whose references were impeccable, consider the position? Miss Mercer had considered it for precisely as long as it took to calculate that the wage was generous and her present situation precarious, and had accepted and packed her small trunk and come. She was 28, and she had been nursing for 5 years, ever since the year that had broken her life in half. Before that year she had been someone else entirely, Miss Catherine Mercer of Fenwick, a country gentleman's daughter, not rich but comfortable, with a snug house and a brother she adored, and a future she had assumed without thinking about it, the unexamined future of a gently bred girl who expects in the natural order of things to marry and keep a house of her own. And then her father had died, leaving more debts than anyone had known of, and the snug house had been sold to pay them, and there had been almost nothing left. And her brother James, 2 years her junior, and the whole of her remaining family had done the thing that ruined and unruined young gentlemen did in those years, which was to take a commission in the army, for there was a great war on across the Channel, and a soldier's pay was a soldier's pay. And Catherine, with no home and no fortune, and no one in the world but James, had gone where James went, as far as a sister respectably could, which in the end was to the city of Brussels, in the terrible bright summer of the year 15, when the whole of the army gathered there for the battle everyone knew was coming, and no one could name. She did not let herself think about Brussels, as a rule. She had a rule about it. The rule was that Brussels lived in a locked room in her, and the door stayed shut, because behind the door was her brother dying of his wounds in a stifling July sick room 3 days after the great battle, with Catherine holding his hand and unable to do one single thing to save him, 23 years old and helpless and learning, in those 3 days, the whole brutal trade she had practiced ever since. And behind the door was a great deal else besides, things she thought about even less than she thought about James, and so the door stayed shut, and Catherine Mercer was a competent, composed, reserved woman of 28 who nursed the dying for her bread, and did not, as a rule, think about Brussels at all. She thought about it now, though, getting down from the chaise before the great gray house, because the strange unease would not leave her, and the unease had something of Brussels in it, some flavor of that locked room, and she did not understand why a house she had never seen should smell, faintly, of the worst, and she made herself finish the thought, honestly, for she was an honest woman even with herself, of the worst, and, in one buried impossible way, the most precious summer of her life. "You'll be the nurse," said the butler, who had opened the door, taking in her plain dark traveling dress and her small trunk, and her composed tired face with the swift, accurate assessment of an upper servant placing a newcomer. "Miss Mercer, we've been expecting you. Her Grace the Dowager is poorly tonight, but stable. You'll see her in the morning. I'll have you shown to your room and sent up some supper." He hesitated, a fractional thing, and then added in the carefully neutral voice servants use for the great people they serve, "His Grace is from home at present, but returns within the week. You'll have settled in by then. He likes the household to run smooth and quiet, His Grace. He don't care for fuss." "I never make fuss," said Catherine. "It is rather the point of me. Thank you. I should be glad of the supper and gladder of the bed. It has been a long road." And she followed the footman up the great staircase, through the grand, cold, beautiful house, to a small, plain, comfortable room near the dowager's apartments that would be hers for as long as the old woman lasted. And she unpacked her small trunk and ate the supper that was sent up, and lay down at last in the strange bed in the strange grand house. And the unease did not leave her, even in sleep, but stood at the foot of the bed all night, like a thing waiting to be recognized, patient, certain, biding its time. And Catherine Mercer slept badly, and dreamed of a city across the sea, and of a candle-lit room, and of a hand she had held that was not her brother's, and woke before dawn, not remembering the dream, but feeling the shape of it, the way one feels the warmth left in a chair by someone who has just risen and gone. The Dowager Duchess of Wynford was 84, and bedridden and dying by inches in the slow, dignified way of the very old whose hearts are simply wearing out, and she was, Catherine discovered within an hour of meeting her, the most alarming and the most delightful patient she had ever had. "So you are the new one," said the old woman when Catherine was shown in, propped against a bank of pillows, tiny and fierce, with a face like a folded map, and eyes that had lost none of their sharpness, though the body around them was failing. "Mercer, sit down where I can see you. I cannot turn my head as I used to, and I dislike talking to a voice. There, let me look at you." And she looked frankly, at length, with the unembarrassed scrutiny of the very old who have not the time left for politeness. "You are not a girl. Good. The last one was a girl, all flutter and tears, no use to anyone. I sent her away. You have a sensible face. You have, in fact, a sad face that has been made sensible by use, which is the most useful kind, for it has learned that weeping changes nothing, and got on with the business of doing what can be done. I know that face. I have worn it myself. Well, Mercer, you will do, I think. Now tell me honestly, for no one in this house will— Am I dying?" "Yes, Your Grace," said Catherine, who had learned long ago that the dying are owed the truth and are usually grateful for it, being surrounded by people who lie to them out of love and find it exhausting. "Not tonight, and not this week, and perhaps not for some months. Your heart is tired, but it is not finished, and with care and rest you may have a good while yet, and a comfortable one, which is what I am here to give you. But yes, you are dying. You have asked me honestly, and I have answered honestly, and I will always answer you honestly, Your Grace, about that or anything, for I find the dying are owed honesty above all things, and get precious little of it. And I had rather be the one person in your house who does not lie to you. If that does not suit, you have only to say, and I will lie as prettily as anyone. But I had rather not." The Dowager Duchess looked at her for a long moment, and then something happened in the folded map face that took Catherine a moment to recognize as the beginning of a smile. "Oh, you will do very well indeed," said the old woman with deep satisfaction. "Honestly, nobody has spoken to me honestly in 2 years. They all tiptoe and murmur and tell me I look better today, as if I were a fool who could not feel her own heart stumbling in her chest. You will not tiptoe. Good. We shall get on, Mercer, you and I. Now ring for some tea, and then come and sit and tell me about yourself, for I am dying and bored, and a dying, bored old woman is owed a story, and you look as though you have one, locked up tight behind that sensible, sad face. I shall not pry it out of you today, but I warn you, I am very old and very curious and very persistent, and I have nothing left to do with my days but watch people and guess at them, and I am extremely good at it, and I shall have the whole of you out by the spring. Consider yourself warned now. The tea." And Catherine Mercer rang for the tea and sat and found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind the old woman's fierce curiosity as she had thought she would, that there was something in the dowager's honesty that answered her own, some recognition between two women who had both learned that weeping changes nothing. And over the following days, as February wore toward March, and Catherine settled into the rhythms of the great quiet house, the two of them formed the swift, deep, peculiar bond that sometimes forms between the dying and the one who tends them, the bond of people who have stopped pretending. And Catherine found that she had not merely a patient but very nearly a friend, the first she had allowed herself in 5 guarded years. She did not tell the dowager about Brussels. The door to that room stayed shut, but she told her a great deal else, about Fenwick and her father, and the snug house sold to pay his debts, about James, a little, the bare fact of a beloved brother lost to the war, about the 5 years of nursing since, the slow building of a guarded, competent life, out of the wreck of the comfortable one she had been born to. And the dowager listened, and watched, and guessed, and was, as she had promised, extremely good at it. And more than once Catherine looked up to find the old sharp eyes resting on her with an expression she could not read, a kind of arrested attention, as though the dowager were turning over some idea she had not yet decided whether to speak. The unease had not left Catherine. If anything, it had grown, in the quiet days of settling in, into a low, constant hum beneath everything, a sense of the house as a held breath, of something waiting. She told herself it was the strangeness of a new place, and the sadness of February, and the daily nearness of death, which always unsettled the spirit however used to it one became. She told herself a great many sensible things, and none of them quite accounted for the way her heart would jump, absurdly, whenever a servant mentioned the absent master of the house, his grace this, his grace that, his grace returns on Thursday, as though the words themselves carried some charge she could not see the source of, nor for the way she found herself more than once pausing in the great portrait gallery before a particular empty space on the wall where a portrait had clearly once hung and been taken down, and feeling, before that blank rectangle of slightly darker wallpaper, the locked door in her shiver on its hinges, for no reason she could name at all. She found the locket on a Wednesday, the day before the Duke was to return, and the finding of it broke her life in half for the second time. It happened by the smallest chance, which is how the largest things so often happen. The dowager had taken a slight chill and was fretful, and had demanded, among the many small demands of the failing and bored, that a particular shawl be fetched from a particular press in a particular room, and the maid who should have fetched it was occupied, and Catherine, who never stood on the dignity of her position and would fetch a shawl as readily as administer a draught, had gone herself. The room was a kind of small private sitting room, little used, and the press held not only shawls but, it transpired, a quantity of the Duke's things that had been set there to be sorted. For his grace was newly returned to using these older family rooms, the butler had mentioned, having spent the years since his accession mostly away, at his other houses or abroad, as though he could not at first bear to settle into the place. And among the things waiting to be sorted, laid over the back of a chair, was a coat. It was a good coat, a gentleman's riding coat of dark blue superfine, well cut and well worn, the kind of coat a man keeps for years, because it has grown comfortable. And it had been set there, Catherine supposed, to have some small repair done, for the lining at one side had begun to come away, and Catherine, who could no more leave a coming-away seam unmended than she could leave a wound undressed, it was the same instinct, the instinct to set right what was broken, that had made her a nurse, picked it up, half meaning to put a stitch or two in it herself while she was about it, for she always carried a needle, and a torn lining was nothing, the work of a minute. And as she turned the coat to find the loose seam, her fingers running along the lining met something hard, something small and hard and flat, sewn into the lining itself, not in the pocket, but inside the lining, between the cloth and the facing, deliberately enclosed, the way one encloses a thing one means never to lose. Catherine's fingers found the shape of it through the silk and went still. It was oval. It was small and oval and flat, with a fine raised pattern on one face that her fingertips read before her mind would let her name it. And a coldness began at the back of her neck and spread down through her whole body, a coldness that had nothing to do with the February chill, because her fingers knew that shape, knew that pattern, had known them all her life, had traced them 10,000 times as a child and a girl and a grieving woman, and there was only one object in the entire world that her fingers knew so well, and it was impossible. It was utterly, flatly impossible that it should be here, sewn into the lining of a strange duke's coat in a house she had never seen. Her hands shaking now, she found the place where the lining had come away, and she worked her fingers in gently, the way she would probe a wound, and she drew the small, hard thing out into the gray light from the window. It was a locket. It was an oval locket of worn gold with a pattern of forget-me-nots raised on its face, a pattern half rubbed away by handling, and a small dent in one edge where it had once been dropped on a stone floor, and a catch that stuck unless you knew the trick of it, which Catherine knew, which Catherine's thumb performed without her telling it to, from 20 years of habit, and the locket opened, as it had always opened for her and stuck for everyone else, and inside was a miniature, very small, of a young woman with Catherine's own dark eyes and a gentle smile, Catherine's mother, dead these 24 years, painted in the one good year of her short life, the miniature her father had given to Catherine on her 10th birthday with his eyes full of tears, saying, "So that you will always carry her with you, my darling, since you were too small to keep her in your memory." And Catherine had carried her, always, every day of her life, against her heart, until the one day she had given her away. She had given her away in Brussels, in a stifling candlelit sick room in the July of the year 15, 3 days after she buried her brother, to a dying man she did not know. "This can't be," Catherine Mercer whispered, standing alone in the cold little room with her mother's locket in her shaking hand and the strange duke's coat fallen at her feet. "This can't be. This can't be." For the locket she had pressed into a dying stranger's hand 5 years ago and 1,000 miles away, the locket she had given up forever, to comfort a man she was certain would be dead by morning, her mother, her dearest possession, the one thing she had loved enough to surrender, was here, in her hand, in this house, sewn into the lining of a living man's coat, over the place where his heart would beat when he wore it. And there was only one way on God's earth that it could be here, only one, and the locked door in Catherine Mercer flew open at last, all the way, and Brussels came flooding out, and she had to put her hand against the wall to stay standing, because the dying stranger had not died after all. The dying stranger had lived, and the dying stranger was the Duke of Wynford, and he had kept her mother over his heart for 5 years. She did not faint, though the room swam. She was not a woman who fainted, having seen too much. She stood with her hand against the wall until the swimming stopped, and then she did the thing her whole hard training had taught her to do in the face of the unbearable, which was to become very calm and very careful, and to attend to the next necessary task, because there is always a next necessary task, and attending to it is how one survives the unbearable. She closed the locket. She sat down in the little used chair with the coat across her knees and the locket in her hand, and she made herself breathe, and she made herself think, and she let Brussels come, all of it, the whole locked room of it, because there was no shutting the door now, and she might as well face what was behind it squarely. It came back not as a story, but as it had happened, in pieces, in heat and candlelight, and the smell of a sick room in July. She had buried James on a Tuesday. The great battle had been fought on the Sunday, 18th of June, and the wounded had poured back into Brussels for days, more than the city could hold, filling the houses and the churches and the very streets. And James, Lieutenant James Mercer, 23, her whole family, had been carried in on the Monday with a wound that the surgeon looked at once and did not look at twice, and had died on the Tuesday with his hand in hers, asking her not to cry, and she had buried him on the Wednesday in a churchyard far from home with strangers for mourners, and had stood at the grave dry-eyed and hollowed out and entirely alone in the world for the first time in her life. And then, because she did not know what else to do with herself, because the alternative was to go back to her lodging and lie down and never get up, she had gone to where the wounded were and offered her hands, for there were never enough hands, and a steady woman who did not faint at blood was worth her weight in gold in those terrible days. And they had set her to work, and she had worked, for hours and then for days, in the houses where the overflow of wounded officers lay, washing and binding and holding and easing, doing the brutal, tender trade she would practice for the rest of her life, learning it in the worst possible school, because the work was the only thing that stood between Catherine Mercer and the abyss that had opened at her brother's grave. And on the third day, or the fourth, the days had run together. They had brought her to a man they had given up on. He was an officer, they told her, a captain, gravely wounded at the battle, a saber cut and worse, who had lain 3 days now in a fever that would not break. And the surgeons had done what they could and shaken their heads and moved on to men they could still save. And someone was needed simply to sit with him, to ease his passing, for he would not last the night and ought not to die alone. And Catherine, who had just learned in the most brutal way what it was to die with someone's hand in yours and what it was to be the one holding the hand, had said yes, of course, and gone in and sat down by the dying captain in the stifling candlelit room and taken his hot, dry, restless hand in hers and prepared to do the one thing she could do, which was to see that he did not die alone. He had been delirious, mostly. He had not known where he was, or who she was, or what year it was. He had spoken, in his fever, to people who were not there, a brother, a mother, men he had commanded, the dead. And Catherine had answered him gently in their names when it eased him, and bathed his burning face, and held him when he thrashed, and held him still when he wept in the fever for the men he had lost, which he did, terribly, a strong man broken open by fever and grief into a child's raw sorrow. And somewhere in that long candle-lit night, Catherine Mercer, who had buried her own brother 3 days before, and had no comfort to give anyone and gave it anyway, had come to feel for the dying stranger a tenderness she could not explain and never afterward tried to, the fierce protective tenderness one feels for a thing entrusted to one's care at the very edge of being lost. And near dawn, when the fever was at its worst and his strength was failing and she truly believed he was going, he had surfaced for a moment, come up through the delirium into a brief, terrible clarity, the way the dying sometimes do at the end. And he had looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes finding hers in the candlelight, and he had said, in a cracked whisper, the only wholly lucid thing he said in all those hours, "I don't want to die. I'm so afraid. Don't let go of me, please. I can't hold on by myself." And Catherine, who could not save him, who knew she could not save him, who had nothing in all the world to give a dying man, had done the only thing she could think of. She had taken her mother's locket from around her own neck, where it had hung every day of her life since she was 10, and she had pressed it into his burning hand and closed his fingers around it, and she had said, holding his hand closed around her mother over his heart, "You are not by yourself. You hold on to this, and you hold on to me, and you hold on. My mother is in here, and she is watching over you now, and I am here, and I am not letting go, and you are not going to die alone, and you are not going to die afraid. Hold on, just until morning. Hold on to her, and hold on to me, and we will get you to morning, and then we will see. Don't you let go. I have got you. Hold on." And he had held on. All through that last terrible hour before dawn, with her mother's locket crushed in his fist and Catherine's hands around his, he had held on, and the dawn had come, and the fever had broken. It had broken near sunrise, the fever, broken all at once, the way the bad ones do, the burning skin going suddenly cool and damp, the wild pulse steadying, the dreadful restlessness easing into the first true sleep he had had in days. And Catherine had sat there in the gray dawn light, holding the hand of a man who, against all the surgeon's judgment and all her own, was not going to die after all, and had wept at last, wept for the first time since James, wept for her brother, and for this stranger and for the whole broken, bleeding world, silently so as not to wake him, with his cooling hand in hers and her mother's locket still crushed in his fingers. She had stayed with him through the morning and into the next day, for the danger was not wholly past. And as he mended, surfacing more and more into lucidity, they had talked, in the broken, exhausted way of a sick room, a few words at a time, and she had learned that his name was Edmund, that he had a brother and a grandmother he loved, that he had lost more men than he could bear to count and carried it like a stone, and he had learned almost nothing of her, for she turned his questions gently aside, being a private woman, and one who did not think her own griefs fit burden for a man fighting his way back from death. He knew her name was Catherine. He knew her hands. He told her once in a low, rough voice she never forgot that he was alive because of her, that he had felt himself letting go that night, and that her voice and her hands and the locket in his fist had been the rope he climbed back up. And Catherine had told him briskly that he was alive because his constitution was stronger than the surgeons reckoned, and he was not to make a romance of it, and had changed the subject because the way he looked at her when he said it frightened her, not for any harm in it, but for the warmth, for the thing it woke in her own chest that she had no business feeling for a patient and could not afford to feel for anyone. And then they had been parted. That was the cruelty of it, the stupid, arbitrary cruelty of war. She had been called away. Another house, another flood of wounded, an urgent need for hands elsewhere in the overflowing city, and Catherine, who was one pair of hands among too few, had been sent where she was needed most, with barely an hour to make her farewells, and she had gone in to him, meaning to tell him, what? She had never known what, only to say goodbye properly, to tell him to keep the locket, that she meant him to have it, But he had been asleep, deeply asleep, the healing sleep he so badly needed, and she had not had the heart to wake him merely for her own sake, and so she had stood a moment looking at him, the dying stranger who had not died, and then she had gone, telling herself she would write, telling herself she would find out where he was sent, telling herself the parting was nothing, a sick-room acquaintance, a thing of no account. But she had not been able to write, for she did not know his surname, nor his regiment, nor where he would be sent when he was well enough to travel. She knew only Edmund, and a face, and a pair of hands she had held for the long hours of a single night, and she had been swept up in the work, and then the work had ended as the wounded died or mended or were shipped home, and then there was no more reason for an English nurse to be in Brussels, and she had come home, to no home, to a hired room, and a new hard trade. And she had told herself over 5 years that the captain named Edmund had surely either died of some later relapse, as such men so often did, or recovered and gone home to a life that had no room in it for the memory of a nurse. And she had locked the whole of it in the room behind the shut door, the worst and most precious summer of her life, and had got on, as she always got on, with the next necessary task. She had never once let herself imagine that he had lived, and remembered, and looked for her. She had not dared. To imagine it was to hope, and hope was a luxury that only made the falling harder, and Catherine Mercer had fallen far enough. And now she sat in a cold little room in a great gray house with her mother's locket in her hand, the locket she had pressed into a dying man's fist and given up forever, sewn out of its hiding place in the lining of a coat belonging to the Duke of Wynford. and she understood with a clarity that shook her to her foundations what it meant that it was here. It meant Edmund had lived. It meant Edmund had kept the locket, had kept it not in a drawer, not in a box, but sewn into his coat, over his heart, where a man keeps a thing he cannot bear to be parted from. It meant that the captain named Edmund and the Duke of Wynford were one man, and it meant, this was the thought that made her press her hand to her mouth, it meant that she had not been hired to nurse the dowager duchess by chance at all. For there were a great many nurses in England, there were a great many agencies, and a great many gentlewomen fallen on hard times who had taken up the trade, and the odds that the Duke of Wynford should happen, by pure chance, to engage the one nurse in all of England who had once held him through a fever in Brussels, those odds were no odds at all. They were impossible. And Catherine Mercer had not survived 5 years of hard, clear thinking to believe in the impossible when a simpler explanation stood plainly before her. She had not been engaged by chance. She had been sought. The Duke of Wynford had found her, had looked for her across 5 years and a whole country, and found her and engaged her under the cover of his grandmother's illness and brought her here, to his house. And had then, for reasons she could not yet fathom, said nothing, revealed nothing, let her come and settle and nurse his grandmother for the better part of a month without once giving the smallest sign that he was the dying stranger she had saved, or that he knew her at all. He returned tomorrow. She would meet him tomorrow, and he did not know that she had found the locket. Catherine Mercer sat for a long time in the cold little room, holding her mother, thinking. And when at last she rose, she had made 3 decisions. In the cool, careful way she made all her decisions, and they were these. She would say nothing tomorrow, would meet the Duke of Wynford as a stranger, as he plainly intended her to, and watch and learn before she showed her hand, for she did not yet understand what game was being played, and a woman in her position did not move until she understood the board. She would keep the locket, would take her mother back, for her mother was hers, given in extremity to a dying man and not to a living duke, and she would not leave her sewn in a coat 1 hour longer, but she would keep, too, the small torn place in the lining exactly as it was, so that the Duke should not know, until she chose, that it had been found. And she would mend the coat's loose seam, the seam she had come to mend, and lay it back exactly where she had found it, and go on with her work and wait and watch, because Catherine Mercer had learned in a hard school that the one who waits and watches and keeps her own counsel holds more cards than she shows. And she meant this time, before she let herself hope or fall or feel anything at all, to understand exactly what the Duke of Wynford wanted, and exactly what it would cost her, before she gave him so much as the knowledge that she remembered his name. If you are listening by your own fire tonight, the lamp turned low, the dark drawn close, the day's long road behind you, then settle in and draw your blanket near, for we have come to the heart of it now, and the heart of it is a question that 2 frightened people will spend the rest of this story trying to answer. Whether a thing born in the extremity of a single desperate night, between 2 strangers at the very edge of death, can become, in the ordinary daylight of 5 years later, something real enough and whole enough to build a life upon. I shall tell you, before the end, where in the world I picture you sitting. But first you must meet the Duke of Wynford, who has carried a nurse's locket over his heart for 5 years, and who is about to discover that the nurse has come at last, and does not, he believes, remember him at all. The Duke of Wynford came home the following evening in the early dark, and Catherine met him the next morning, and the meeting was nothing like what either of them had braced for, because each of them was performing a part for the other, and neither knew that the other was performing too. He sent for her after breakfast, properly through the housekeeper, the master of the house summoning his grandmother's nurse to ask after his grandmother's health, the most ordinary thing in the world. And Catherine went down to the library where he waited, having spent a sleepless night schooling her face into the composed professional mask she had worn for 5 years, determined to give nothing away, to be only Miss Mercer, the nurse, to watch and learn, and she opened the library door and saw him, and very nearly undid the whole of her careful resolve in the first 3 seconds, because the sight of him alive was so much more than she had prepared for. She had been bracing to recognize the dying stranger in the powerful Duke. She had not been prepared for how completely he was both at once. He stood by the window, tall and dark and grave, a man of 34 in the plain good clothes of a country gentleman, with gray at his temples that had not been there in Brussels, and a stillness about him that was new, the stillness of a man who has learned to hold himself very controlled. And for a moment he was a stranger, a great cold Duke she had never seen. And then he turned his head, and the morning light fell across his face, and Catherine saw beneath the 5 years and the gray and the ducal stillness the face of the man whose burning forehead she had bathed through a July night, the man who had wept in her arms for his lost soldiers and held her mother's locket in his fist and climbed back from death up the rope of her voice. And the recognition went through her like a blade, and it was all she could do to keep her face still, to drop her professional curtsy, to say, in a voice she was proud to hear come out steady, "Your Grace sent for me. Her Grace the Dowager passed a comfortable night and is resting well this morning." And the Duke of Wynford looked at the nurse who had saved his life and whom he had searched 5 years to find, and had brought at last into his own house. And Catherine, watching him with all the trained attention of her trade, saw what it cost him to keep his own face still, saw the flicker, swiftly mastered, the hunger swiftly veiled, the way a starving man looks for half a second at bread before he remembers his manners, saw, in short, that he knew her perfectly well, and was hiding it with exactly the same desperate care that she was hiding her own knowing, and that the two of them were standing in a grand library, performing strangers at each other while the air between them rang like a struck bell with everything neither would say. "Thank you, Miss Mercer," said the Duke of Wynford, and his voice was the voice from the sick room, deeper now and steadier, but unmistakably the same, and it raised the hair on Catherine's arms. "I am glad to hear it. My grandmother she is very dear to me. I have been anxious about her. The household speaks highly of your care. The butler tells me she has taken to you, which she does not do easily, and the improvement in her spirits this past month has been marked. I am in your debt." A pause, a fractional pause, and Catherine heard the weight he put on the last word, debt, heard him hear it himself, heard him hurry past it. "I wished only to thank you, and to say that you are to have whatever you require for her comfort or your own. You have only to ask the housekeeper, or, if it is a matter of any moment, myself. I am from home a great deal, but while my grandmother she is as she is, I mean to be here. So you will see something of me. I hope you will be comfortable." "Your Grace is very kind," said Catherine. "I want for nothing. Her Grace is an excellent patient, when she is not being a terrible one, and we understand each other very well." And she allowed herself, because to allow nothing would itself have been a kind of tell, the smallest dry smile, and she saw it land on him, saw the breath he took, saw the man behind the Duke flinch as though the small, familiar dryness of her had touched an open wound, which she understood, for his every word and turn of voice was touching hers. And they stood a moment longer in the ringing air, two people drowning in everything they would not say, and then Catherine curtsied again and withdrew, on legs that were not quite steady, and closed the library door behind her, and stood in the corridor with her hand pressed to her chest, where her mother's locket now hung once more, returned to its place over her own heart, and thought, "He knows me. He knows me, and he will not say so, and I will not say so, and so we are to do this dance, and I do not yet know why he will not say so, and until I know why, I dare not say so either. What are you afraid of, Edmund? For you are afraid. I saw it. A man does not look at bread like that and then hide that he is hungry unless he is afraid of something. What are you so afraid of that you would search 5 years for me and then, having found me, say nothing at all?" What the Duke of Wynford was afraid of was a thing he had been afraid of for 5 years, and it was this, that the most important night of his life had been to the woman who shared it merely Tuesday. He had never told anyone the whole of it. He had come home from the war a changed man, gone gray before his time, grave and shut and haunted, and his family had attributed it to the battle, to the things he had seen and the men he had lost, and they were not wrong, for those things had marked him deep. But they did not know about the other thing, the thing that marked him deeper, which was a woman named Catherine whose surname he had not learned, who had held him through the night he should have died, and given him her mother's locket, and a reason to climb back into the world, and whom he had lost, while he slept, before he could so much as tell her his full name, or beg her not to go. He had woken that morning in Brussels to find her gone, and no one could tell him where. The city was a churning chaos of the dying and the mending and the dead, and his Catherine, for he had thought of her as his Catherine from the moment he was lucid enough to think at all, had been swallowed up in it, leaving him nothing but a Christian name and a locket, and a memory of a voice saying, "Hold on, I have got you." He had searched as soon as he could stand, asked everyone, haunted the houses where the wounded lay, and learned only that a Miss Catherine, an Englishwoman, a gentlewoman by her speech, had nursed there and been sent elsewhere, and then, it was thought, gone home. No one knew where, no one knew her family, no one knew anything but that she had been very good and very quiet, and had buried a brother the week before she came. A brother. That one new fact had nearly broken his heart, that the woman who gave him her dead mother's locket to comfort his dying had been, herself, freshly bereaved, holding him through his terror 3 days after burying her own brother, and he had not even known, that night, to comfort her in return. He had looked for her for 5 years. It had become, he knew, something not entirely sane, the kind of fixed idea a man clings to because the alternative is to admit that the one clean, shining thing in the wreckage of those years was gone for good. He had advertised, discreetly, in the papers. A gentleman wishes to find the Englishwoman, Christian name Catherine, who nursed the wounded in Brussels in the summer of 1815, to discharge a debt of gratitude. Nothing had come of it, or rather a great deal had come of it, for a duke advertising a reward draws every liar in the kingdom, and he had interviewed a dozen false Catherines, grasping women who had read the advertisement and learned the few public details and come to claim a duke's gratitude, and each one had been a small fresh grief, for each one was not her. He had nearly given up. His brother had died, and he had become a duke, with all the weight of it, and the search had seemed, in his grimmer moods, the foolish obsession of a man who could not let go of a fever dream. For what was she, truly, but a memory shaped by delirium and gratitude and the desperate need of a dying man for someone to hold on to? Perhaps the real Catherine, if he ever found her, would be an ordinary woman who scarcely remembered him, who had nursed 100 dying officers and could not have told one from another, to whom that endless night had been simply another night's work, simply Tuesday. And then, 3 months ago, he had found her not through the advertisements but through the most ordinary channel imaginable, a respectable nursing agency to which his man of business had applied for an attendant for the dowager, and among the candidates' particulars had come a name, Miss Catherine Mercer, gentlewoman, 28, 5 years' experience, references impeccable, served as a volunteer nurse to the wounded at Brussels, 1815, and the Duke of Wynford had read those words and gone cold and still and known with absolute certainty, before he had seen her face or learned another fact, that he had found her at last. And then he had not known what to do. For all 5 years of searching had been, he realized, the easy part, the having of a goal, the motion toward it, the structure it gave to his grief. He had never thought past the finding. He had imagined the finding as a kind of arrival, a resolution, and discovered now that it was nothing of the sort, that it was only the beginning of the very thing he was most afraid of, which was the answer to the question he had carried for 5 years. Did that night mean to her a fraction of what it meant to me, or was I only one dying man among the many she held? Only Tuesday? and he found he could not bear to ask it. He found that as long as he did not ask, he could keep the hope, and that to reveal himself, to say, "I am the captain you saved. I have carried your locket 5 years. That night remade my whole life." To say all that, and to watch her face, and to see in it not recognition and answering feeling, but only a nurse's kind professional sympathy, a vague, "Oh yes, I believe I do recall. You were very ill. I am glad you recovered." That he could not survive. It would kill the thing he had lived on for 5 years. And so he had done the coward's thing, the thing he despised himself for and could not stop doing. He had engaged her under the cover of his grandmother's illness, brought her into his house, and then said nothing, kept his secret, watched her, fed himself on the daily nearness of her, and put off, day after day, the unbearable risk of finding out whether he had spent 5 years in love with a real woman or only with a memory of one. He did not know that she had found the locket. He did not know that she remembered him perfectly, had remembered him every day for 5 years, had locked the memory away precisely because it was too precious and too painful to bear looking at, did not know that she was, at that very moment, in another part of his house, asking herself the exact mirror of his own question. Does he want the woman or only the memory? Does he love me or only the angel nurse who saved his life, the debt, the fever dream? And watching him as warily as he watched her, each of them performing a stranger, each of them certain they were the only one in the house who knew the truth, each of them terrified of the very thing the other was terrified of. 2 people who had saved each other once and could not now find the courage to say so, circling the same locked door from opposite sides, both with the key in hand, both afraid to turn it. It was the dowager duchess in the end who turned the key, for she had been watching the pair of them with her sharp old guessing eyes, and she had guessed a very great deal, and she had decided, being very old and very near death, and entirely out of patience with the waste of time, to meddle, which was one of the few pleasures left to her. She had noticed first the change in her nurse. Catherine had thought she hid it. She did not from the dowager, who had nothing to do all day but watch, and was extremely good at it. The old woman had marked the new tension in the composed, sad face, the way Miss Mercer had grown distracted and then schooled herself out of it, the way she startled when the Duke's name was spoken. And she had marked, too, the change in her grandson, who had come home graver and stranger than ever, and who found, the dowager observed, a remarkable number of reasons to visit his ailing grandmother at exactly the hours her nurse would be in attendance, and who sat in the sick room not looking at the nurse with a concentration that fooled no one over the age of 80. And the Dowager Duchess of Wynford had put these things together in the long, idle hours of her dying, and had arrived at a conclusion so romantic and so unlikely that she had distrusted it at first, and then, on further watching, had become certain of it, and had resolved to act, because she did not have the time to wait for 2 frightened young fools to find their own courage, and because she found she wanted, very much, before she died, to see her grave-haunted grandson smile as he had not smiled since before the war. So she laid a trap, of the gentle, ruthless kind that dying grandmothers are uniquely placed to lay. She arranged to be asleep, or to seem asleep. She sent word to her grandson that she wished to see him at 4 o'clock, and she ensured that Miss Mercer would be in the room at 4 o'clock about some small nursing task. And then, when the Duke came in, the dowager was apparently deep in the light doze of the very old, not to be disturbed, leaving her grandson and her nurse alone together in the quiet sick room with the fire crackling and the February dark coming down outside, and nothing to do but wait for her to wake. And the old woman lay still, with her eyes shut and her ears open, and listened, and was rewarded. For a long while neither of them spoke. Catherine moved quietly about her tasks. The Duke sat by the fire, the silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. And then the Duke of Wynford, looking into the fire, said in a low voice, as though to himself, the thing that had been building in him for a month and would not be held back another hour, "You don't remember me, do you, from before?" It was not quite a question, and Catherine, across the room, went still with her hands full of the dowager's medicines, and her heart began to pound. For here it was, the door swinging open at last, and she had sworn to herself to wait and watch and understand before she showed her hand. But there was something in his voice, a kind of bleak, braced readiness for a wound, that went straight past all her careful resolve. And she heard herself ask, instead of answering, the only thing that mattered, "Why have you not asked me before now? You have known me since the hour you came home. I saw it in the library the first morning. You knew me, and you said nothing. And you have said nothing for a fortnight, and you have looked at me as though—" She stopped. "Why have you said nothing, Your Grace? You searched for me. I know you searched for me. I am not a fool. Nurses do not come to dukes by accident. You found me, and you brought me here, and then you said nothing at all. Why? What are you afraid of? For you are afraid. I have watched men be afraid for 5 years, and I know the look of it. You are afraid of me, of this, of something. Tell me what." "I am tired of the dance, Edmund. I have been dancing it as carefully as you have, and I find I have not the strength for it after all. Tell me what you are afraid of, and I will tell you the truth in return, whatever it is. But one of us must stop performing first, and I find—" Her voice broke, just slightly. "I find it may as well be me, for I have lost everyone I ever loved by being too careful and too proud to speak in time. And I buried my brother 5 years ago wishing I had said more, and I will not do it again. So, you first or me first, Edmund. But no more silence. I cannot bear the silence. I have borne a great deal, but I cannot bear this." And the Duke of Wynford turned from the fire and looked at her, at Catherine Mercer, who had just called him by the name no one in this house knew, the name only she had ever had, the sick-room name, Edmund. And the whole careful structure of 5 years' fear came down at once. "You called me Edmund," he said unsteadily. Then you do remember. You remember my name. You remember—" "I remember everything," said Catherine. "I have remembered everything every day for 5 years. I locked it away because it was too dear and too painful to look at, the way you lock away a grief. But I never forgot one moment of it, not one. And I knew you the instant the light fell on your face in the library, and I have spent a fortnight performing a stranger at you because I did not understand why you were performing a stranger at me, and I was afraid—" Now it was her turn, and she made herself say it, the mirror of his own buried fear. "I was afraid that you wanted only the nurse, the angel of the sick room, the woman who saved your life. I was afraid that what you felt for me was gratitude and a debt and the memory of one desperate night, and that if I let myself believe it was more, I should be building on a fever dream, loving a man who loved only what I once did for him, and not me, Catherine, the actual woman, who is older now and harder and sadder, and not an angel at all, but only a tired nurse with a sharp tongue. I was afraid you were in love with a memory. That is what I was afraid of. Now you. What were you afraid of? Tell me. You owe me yours. I have given you mine." "I was afraid," said the Duke of Wynford, "of the exact same thing from the other side. Word for word. I was afraid that the night which remade my entire life had been, to you, merely another night's work, that I was one dying man among 100 you held, that if I revealed myself you would look at me with kind professional sympathy and not the smallest answering feeling, and that it would kill the one thing I have lived on for 5 years, the memory of your hands and your voice and the locket you put in my fist." He took a step toward her. "I searched for you for 5 years, Catherine. I advertised. I interviewed a dozen false Catherines who read my notice and came to claim a duke's gratitude, and each one was a small, fresh grief. I went gray looking for you. My family thinks it was the war. It was the war, but it was also you, the not knowing, the having held the one clean, shining thing in all that wreckage and lost it before I could learn its name. And then I found you, through an agency, a piece of paper with your name on it. and I knew it was you before I saw your face. And I lost my nerve entirely, because I would rather live forever not knowing than know, for certain, that I had spent 5 years in love with a woman who did not remember me. That was my cowardice. That was my silence. But you have just told me you remember everything, that you knew me in the library. And Catherine, do you understand what that means? It means we have spent 5 years, the both of us, afraid of the very same thing. Each certain we were the only one who carried it, each terrified the other felt nothing, when all the while... His voice failed him, and he simply finished rough and plain. When all the while it was real for both of us. It was never one-sided. It was never a fever dream. We were both there, and have been for 5 years. We were only too frightened and too far apart to know it. Catherine could not speak. She stood with the dowager's medicines in her hands and tears running freely down her face, the careful, composed mask gone entirely. 5 years of locked-away grief and longing and impossible hope pouring out at once now that the door stood open, and the Duke of Wynford crossed the room to her and took the medicines gently out of her hands and set them down and took her 2 hands in his, the hands that had held him through the fever, that he had searched 5 years to hold again. And he held them and looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things are too large for words, and one only to be stood inside of. "There is one fear left," Catherine managed at last, "and I must speak it because we have sworn no more silence, and because it is the one that frightens me most of all, now that the others are gone." She drew a shaking breath. "It is this. What if you are right, that it was real, and we both carried it 5 years, but what we carried is the memory, Edmund? The people we were that night, the dying captain and the grieving nurse, frozen in the amber of the worst night of both our lives. Those 2 people are gone. You are a duke now, grave and powerful and shut. I am a hard-tired nurse of 28 who has buried her whole family and built a small guarded life and forgotten how to hope. We are not the 2 people who met in that sick room. And I am afraid, I am so afraid, that we love those 2 people, the ones in the amber, and that we will reach for each other now and find only strangers, 2 altered, grieving people who share a memory and nothing else, and that the reaching will spoil even the memory, which is the one good thing I have. I had rather keep the memory whole and untouched than risk it on the chance that the living man and the living woman have nothing left in common but a single July night. Do you see? It is the last fear. It may be the truest one. We do not know each other at all, Edmund, not as we are now. We know only who we were." And the Duke of Wynford held the nurse's hands in his, and considered this, for it was a real fear, and a wise one, and he would not insult her by waving it away. And then he answered it in a way that was so exactly right that Catherine understood, hearing it, that the last fear was groundless because no stranger could have answered her so. "Then we will get to know each other now," he said. "As we are, that is the whole of the answer, and it is very simple, though it will not be quick. I am not asking you to marry me tonight on the strength of a 5-year-old night. You are quite right that it would be folly. We should be marrying ghosts. I am asking you only this. Stay. Nurse my grandmother, who loves you and who I begin to suspect arranged this entire conversation by pretending to be asleep." And from the bed came a small, unrepentant sound that was not quite a snore. "And while you are here, let us simply know each other. Let me learn the hard-tired, sharp-tongued woman of 28, and you learn the grave-shut duke, and let us find out, in the ordinary daylight over weeks, whether there is anything between the people we are now beyond the memory of the people we were. If there is not, and if we find we are only 2 strangers with a shared July, then you will have lost nothing. The memory will be safe. You may keep it whole and go on with your life and I with mine. And we will both be grateful for that one good night and ask no more of it. But if there is, Catherine, If the living man and the living woman find they like each other as well as the dying captain and the grieving nurse once did, then we will have something far better than a memory in amber. We will have a real thing between real present people, tested in daylight, that we may build a real life upon. I am not afraid of the test. I do not think you should be either, for I have a strong suspicion, having watched you for a fortnight, that I shall like the hard, tired, sharp-tongued nurse of 28 even better than I liked the angel of the sick room, for the angel saved my life in a single night, which is a great deal, but the nurse argues with my grandmother and makes her laugh and tells dying old women the truth they are owed, which is, I begin to think, a finer and a rarer and a more lovable thing, and one I should very much like the rest of my life to get to know. The Dowager Duchess, having turned the key and forced the two of them into the open, did not then sit back and let matters take their course, for she had decided to manage this romance to its conclusion the way she had managed everything in her long, imperious life, and she had, as she frequently reminded them both, very little time in which to do it. She made herself, in the weeks that followed the recognition, a kind of fierce, delighted matchmaker from her sick bed, and she was shameless about it. She required Catherine's attendance at hours that happened to coincide with her grandson's visits, and then required, with transparent cunning, some object from a distant room that would take the nurse a quarter-hour to fetch, and contrive that the Duke should be sent to help her fetch it. She fell conveniently asleep at useful moments. She asked the two of them leading questions and watched their answers with the open relish of a woman at a play. And she talked to Catherine, in the long, quiet hours of nursing, about her grandson, telling her the things a man will never tell of himself, the boyhood, the gentleness under the gravity, the brother he had loved and lost, and the weight the dukedom had dropped on shoulders that had wanted only to be a soldier, and then, the war over, to be left alone with his grief. "I shall tell you the thing you most need to know about him," the Dowager said one afternoon, "and then you may stop worrying the question I can see plain as print on that sensible face, whether he loves the nurse or the woman, the memory or the living creature. I have watched him love you both ways, child, and I will tell you the difference, for I have had 84 years to learn what love looks like, and I am too near death to waste any being tactful. When he first came home from the war, and for years after, he loved a memory. I watched it eat him. He loved an angel who had saved him, a shining thing in the dark, and the loving of it made him gray and strange and shut, because one cannot live with a memory only haunts. That was love of a kind, but it was the haunting kind, the kind that wastes a man. And then you came, and for a fortnight he loved the memory still, and looked at you and saw the angel, only worse, for your being near. But this past month, since the night I shut my eyes and let you two fools talk, I have watched it change. I have watched him stop seeing the angel and start seeing you. Discover that the living woman is sharper and sadder and funnier and more difficult than the angel ever was, and like her, more in mind, not less, for all of it. And that is the difference, and the whole of it. A man who loves a memory wants you to be the memory. He is disappointed when you are not. He keeps reaching past the living woman for the ghost. A man who has come to love the living woman is delighted. When you are not the memory, delighted by every way you differ from it. And my grandson is delighted by you, child. I have watched him be delighted. He does not want the angel any longer. He wants the nurse who tells dying old women the truth and argues about books and cannot take a kindness without flinching. He wants the difficult living article, and I am surer of it than of anything in years. So stop worrying. He loves the woman. Trust an old woman too near the end to lie. And Catherine, who had indeed been worrying exactly that question in the small hours, found the old woman's words a greater comfort than any reassurance the Duke himself could have given her. For the Duke was a party to it, and might deceive himself. But the Dowager was a fierce, honest, dying observer, with no reason left to flatter anyone. and if the dowager had watched the haunting turn to delight, then perhaps it was safe after all to believe it. And Catherine carried the old woman's distinction away with her and turned it over many times, the difference between the man who wants you to be the memory and the man who is delighted you are not, and found it the wisest thing anyone had ever told her about love, and found, watching the Duke in the days after with this new lens, that it was true, that he was indeed delighted by her every difference from the angel, lit up by her sharpness, drawn to exactly the difficult, sad, real parts a man in love with a ghost would have wished away. And the last of her worrying eased, and she began cautiously, against 5 years of training, to believe. And so they did the wise, unhurried thing, through the long tale of that winter and into the spring. They got to know each other in the ordinary daylight as the people they now were. It was not a courtship anyone watching would have recognized as one, for it happened mostly in a sick room and a library and the long, quiet corridors of a great house in mourning before the fact. But it was a courtship for all that, the truest kind. The kind built not on balls and bouquets, but on hours of real talk and the slow accumulation of small known things. The Duke found reasons to be at home, and then stopped troubling to find reasons. He simply was at home, more than he had been since the war, and the household marked it, and the dowager marked it with enormous satisfaction, and rallied, in fact, somewhat, for the dying will sometimes rally to see a thing through, and the dowager duchess had decided she was not going to die until she had seen her grandson settled, and informed Catherine of this decision frankly, as a fixed point around which the nursing might be planned. There was the matter, too, of the locket, of what to do about the fact that Catherine had taken it back, and mended the lining and laid the coat where she found it, and said nothing, for that small deception sat between them unspoken through the whole of the recognition, and it had to be reckoned with before there could be perfect honesty between two people who had sworn off silence. It came out a few days after the sick-room scene, when the Duke, with a diffidence that sat strangely on a man of his rank, confessed that he had a thing to tell her that shamed him, and told her about the coat, that he had had her locket sewn into the lining of it by his valet within a month of losing her in Brussels, over the heart, where he could keep it always and feel it there, that he had worn that coat, or had the locket moved to whatever coat he wore for 5 years, that it had been his talisman and his secret and the one physical proof that the night had been real, and that he had meant, he said, going red, to find some way to return it to her, now that she was found, to give her mother back to her, only he had not yet found the courage, for the giving back would mean the confessing of the keeping, and the confessing of the keeping would mean admitting how far gone he was, how he had carried her over his heart for 5 years, like a lovesick boy, and he had been afraid of what she would think of a duke who did such things. And Catherine, who had been waiting for exactly this moment, drew the locket out from where it now hung once more around her own neck, over her own heart, and showed it to him, and watched his face change. "You need not find the courage to return it," she said gently. "I found it a month ago, Edmund, in the lining of that very coat. I had gone to fetch a shawl for your grandmother, the coat was there waiting for a repair, the lining had come away, and I am constitutionally unable to leave a torn thing unmended. So I picked it up to put a stitch in it, and my fingers found the locket through the silk and knew it, for I had worn it 20 years before I gave it to you. That is how I learned you had lived, how I learned the captain was the Duke. I took my mother back, for she was mine, and I would not leave her in a coat an hour longer than I must. And I mended the lining and laid the coat where I found it and said nothing, because I did not yet understand the game and dared not move until I did. So you see, we each kept a silence about this locket, and each had our reasons, and neither of us need be ashamed, for they were the silences of two frightened people protecting a thing too dear to risk. But there is to be no more silence between us, so here is mine, confessed, and the locket is back where it belongs, over my heart, where my mother rode for 20 years before she rode over yours for 5. She smiled, a little wet. I am glad she kept you company, Edmund. She was a great one for looking after people, my mother, by all accounts, and I think she would be glad to know that the last and longest looking after she ever did was to keep a frightened, dying soldier company until his nurse could find her way back to him. We will keep her now, the both of us, near us all our lives, for she has rather become the patron saint of this whole strange story, and it would be ungrateful to put her in a drawer. And the Duke of Wynford looked at his mother-in-law-to-be's portrait, hanging now over the heart of the woman he loved instead of his own, and felt the last small shame of the secret-keeping dissolve into something much larger and warmer, and he reached out and touched the locket very gently where it lay against Catherine, the way a man touches a holy thing, and said only, "Hold on, that is what you told me, with her in my hand. Hold on to her, and hold on to me." I held on to both. For 5 years I held on to both, and now I have got the both of you, the locket and the woman, for good. And I find I do not intend ever to let go of either, having held on this long. She kept me company, your mother, in the dark. I should like to spend the rest of my life keeping her daughter company in the light. It seems a fair return for a locket. They talked of everything. Catherine learned the grave-shut Duke and found him, beneath the gravity and the shutness, to be much the man she had glimpsed in the fever, kind and deeply honorable, and carrying his losses like stones, and possessed of a dry, buried humor that took weeks to coax out, and was worth the coaxing. He learned the hard-tired, sharp-tongued nurse, and found her, beneath the hardness, to be brave past anything he had known, and clear-eyed, and unexpectedly funny, and so accustomed to giving care, and so unaccustomed to receiving it that the first time he did her some small kindness, sent up a book he thought she would like, having noticed what she read, she did not know how to take it, and he understood, with a pang, that here was a woman who had been pouring herself out for others for 5 years, and had quite forgotten that anyone might pour anything back. So he set himself quietly to pouring things back, and she, by slow degrees, learned to let him. There was a night, early in the daylight courtship, when the Duke told Catherine the rest of Brussels, his half of it, the half she had never known, for she had only ever seen the fevered captain, and not the man inside the fever, and it changed the way she understood the whole of that July. They were in the library late, the household abed. It had become their habit, these late library hours, the one time the great house was wholly theirs, and they could simply talk. And Catherine had asked him, gently, as she had once asked the Duke of Hawkridge's grandson a different question, for she was a woman who asked the true questions, what he remembered of that night, for she had wondered all these years how much a man so deep in fever could possibly have kept. "More than you would think," said the Duke, looking into the fire. "Not the early part. The early part is gone, the days before, the battle itself, mercifully gone. But the night you came, I remember the night you came with a clarity I have remembered nothing else. I think because it was the night I decided to live, and a man remembers the night he decides to live." He was quiet a moment. "You must understand what I was, that night, before you came. I was not only dying of my wounds, Catherine. I was choosing to die. I had given up. I had led men into that battle, my men I had known for years, men I had promised their mothers I would look after. And I had watched them die, most of them, in a single afternoon, torn apart around me while I lived, and I had come out of it with a saber cut and a fever and a conviction, fixed and absolute, that I did not deserve to survive what they had not, that there was no reason on earth I should live and they should die, that the only decent thing left for me to do was to follow them. I was not fighting the fever. I was welcoming it. The surgeons thought I was past saving. They were wrong. I was perfectly savable. I was simply refusing to be saved, letting go on purpose because I could not bear to be the one who lived. That is what you walked into, a man who had decided to die of guilt and was using a fever to do it." Catherine sat very still, for she had not known this. She had thought him simply a desperately ill man fighting to live. She had not known she had walked into the room of a man trying to die. "And then you came," said the Duke, And you took my hand, and you did not let go. And here is the thing I have never told anyone, the thing I have carried 5 years. You did not save my life by breaking the fever. The fever would have broken, or not on its own. Bodies do as they do. You saved my life by giving me a reason to stop welcoming death, and you did it without knowing you were doing it, without knowing I was trying to die at all. When I said I can't hold on by myself, I did not mean the fever. I meant the living. I meant I could not find a single reason to climb back into a world where my men were dead and I was not. And you put your mother into my hand, your dead mother, the dearest thing you owned, and you told me she was watching over me and that you had me and that we would get to morning together. And you, a stranger, who I later learned had buried your own brother 3 days before, who had every reason of your own to welcome the dark. You chose instead to spend your strength holding a dying stranger to the light. And I lay there with your mother in my fist and thought, if this woman, who has lost everything I have lost and more, who has more reason to give up than I do, can choose to hold on and to hold me on, then perhaps it is not, after all, the decent men who follow the dead. Perhaps the decent thing is the harder thing. Perhaps the decent thing is to hold on, as she is holding on, as she is holding me. That is what saved me, Catherine, not your hands on my fever, your choice to hold to the light when you had every reason to let go of it, made visible to a man who had decided to let go. You did not nurse me back to life. You shamed me back to it, in the gentlest possible way, by being braver in your grief than I was being in mine. And I have spent 5 years needing to find you again, not only to thank you, not only because I loved you, but because I needed the woman who taught me that lesson to know that I learned it and have lived it every hard day since, on the strength of one night holding her mother in my fist. The last fear died one evening in the library undramatically over a disagreement about a book, for they fell into an argument, a real one, sharp and delighted and unguarded, the kind of argument that 2 well-matched minds fall into for the sheer pleasure of it. And somewhere in the middle of it, Catherine realized that she had entirely forgotten to be careful, forgotten the amber and the ghosts and the wise, unhurried test, forgotten everything except the simple present pleasure of disagreeing with this particular living man in this particular firelit room. And she stopped, mid-sentence, and looked at him, and he saw her face change and stopped too, and they looked at each other in the firelight, and both of them understood without a word that the test was concluded and the verdict was in, that the living man and the living woman liked each other every bit as well as the dying captain and the grieving nurse ever had, better, more deeply, with 5 years of growing thrown in, that they were not strangers sharing a memory but 2 whole present people who had, against every probability, found each other twice, once at the edge of death and once in the ordinary light of a library argument, and loved each other both times, and would, it was now perfectly clear, go on loving each other for as long as there was breath in either of them to argue with. "Well," said Catherine, a little unsteadily, into the silence where the argument had been. "Well," agreed the Duke of Wynford, and there was a great deal in the single word. "That is the test concluded, I think," said Catherine. "I find I have stopped guarding the memory. I forgot it entirely just now. I was simply here, with you, arguing about a book and enjoying it more than I have enjoyed anything in 5 years. And I think it means, said the Duke, that we are no longer 2 people who share a July. I think it means we are 2 people, full stop, who would like to share a great many more months than July of every kind of weather. I think it means I should like to ask you something, Catherine, that I was wise enough not to ask you a month ago, and would be a fool not to ask you now. But I find I am afraid again, a different fear this time, a good, clean, ordinary fear. And so I shall gather my courage first, if you will allow me a moment, for I have only one chance to ask it, and I should like to ask it properly." But he was not, in the end, to be allowed his moment, nor to ask it properly that evening, for the world, which had left them alone all winter, chose that exact week to intrude, in the person of a beautiful, well-born, and extremely determined young woman who had every intention of being the next Duchess of Wynford herself, and who did not propose to be supplanted by a hired nurse without a fight. Her name was Lady Sophia Vane, and she was the daughter of the Earl of Marbury, and she had been raised from the cradle in the certain expectation of a great marriage, and she had decided some time ago, and with her ambitious mother, the Countess of Marbury, firmly behind her, that the Duke of Wynford should be it. It was not an unreasonable ambition, by the cold reckoning of the world. The Vanes and the families of Wynford had long been connected. Lady Sophia was beautiful, accomplished, and impeccably bred, and before the Duke had become so strange and shut and difficult to pin down, there had been a general understanding among the people who arranged such things that a match between the houses would be suitable, almost expected. The Duke himself had never said a word to encourage it. He had been too sunk in his 5-year search and his grief to think of marrying anyone, but he had never quite said a word to kill it either, and Lady Sophia and her mother had taken his silence for the slow, inevitable ripening of a sure thing, and had been waiting, with mounting impatience, for the Duke to do his duty and come to the point. And then word had reached them, for servants talk, and great houses leak, that the Duke of Wynford was suddenly very much at home, where he had not been in years, that he was spending a remarkable amount of time in his dying grandmother's sick room, and that the cause of this transformation appeared to be, of all the impossible things, his grandmother's hired nurse, a nobody, a Miss Mercer, a gentlewoman fallen so far as to nurse for her bread. The Countess of Marbury had heard this and refused to believe it, and then had heard it again from a better source and been forced to believe it, and had descended upon Wynford with her daughter in tow on a pretext of a charitable visit to the ailing dowager, with the true purpose of inspecting the threat, and, if it proved real, destroying it. She found it real. One dinner, for the Duke could not refuse to receive the Earl of Marbury's family, however little he wished to, was enough to show the Countess everything. She watched the Duke's grave shut face, and she saw the precise instant it changed, which was when Miss Mercer was mentioned. She watched him guard the change and fail, and the Countess of Marbury, who was every bit as good at watching and guessing as the dowager herself, only without any of the dowager's kindness, understood within the hour that the Duke of Wynford was in love with his grandmother's nurse, and that the situation was very far gone, and that nothing but swift and ruthless action would save her daughter's prospects. And so, the following day, she struck, not at the Duke, whom she could not touch, but at Catherine, whom she believed she could destroy with a word, as one destroys any servant who has reached above her station, by making a public scandal of it, by shaming the nurse out of the house, by exposing the whole improper business to the censure of the world, before the Duke could do anything so disastrous as marry the creature. She chose her moment with care. The dowager, rallying, had expressed a wish for a little company, a small evening party, nothing grand, a few neighboring families, the most she could manage, and the Duke, to please her, had arranged it. And the Marburys, of course, were among the guests, and so was a sufficient number of the local gentry to constitute, for the Countess's purposes, a public. And midway through the evening, in the drawing-room, with Catherine present, for the dowager had insisted her nurse attend, both for her care and, the old woman said with a glint, for the pleasure of her company, the Countess of Marbury rose, and in a clear, caring voice, with the air of a woman performing a painful public duty, sprang her trap. "I hope I may be forgiven," she said, "for speaking plainly on a matter that I think the company, and most particularly our dear Dowager Duchess, ought to be aware of. For I speak only out of concern for this family, to which I have long been attached. It has come to my notice, indeed it can hardly have escaped anyone's notice, that there is a person in this household who has, I fear, quite forgotten her place, a hired nurse, a servant, however genteel her origins are said to be, and we have only her word for those. And this servant has, by arts I shall not dignify by naming, contrived to make herself the object of attentions from his grace that are most unsuitable, most improper, and most damaging to the honor of a great house. I do not blame his grace, who is a man and generous, and has been worn down by grief and his grandmother's illness into a softness any designing woman might exploit. I blame the woman. I blame the nurse who has used her position at a dying lady's bedside, at a dying lady's very bedside, to insinuate herself where she has no right to be, to angle for a coronet so far above her that the ambition would be laughable if it were not so disgraceful. And I say before this company that it is a scandal, and that no family that respects itself can permit it, and that the creature should be dismissed this very night, before she does more harm. And I am certain, when our dear dowager understands how she has been imposed upon, how this servant has worked upon her affection and her grandson's pity to feather her own nest, that her grace will be the first to agree the woman must go. A dreadful silence fell. Every eye in the drawing-room turned, some avid, some embarrassed, some merely hungry for scandal, to where Catherine Mercer stood, in her plain dark dress, beside the dowager's chair. The Duke of Wynford was on his feet, his grey face gone white with a fury that would, in another moment, have brought the whole weight of his rank down on the Countess of Marbury in a way she would not have survived socially for a decade. But Catherine, who had stood through the Countess's speech perfectly still and perfectly composed, the trained stillness of a woman who has faced worse than a drawing-room, laid her hand briefly on the dowager's frail shoulder, a small reassurance, and then stepped forward into the center of the room and spoke first. And her voice was so calm and so clear that the Duke's fury checked itself, and the room held its breath. "Lady Marbury is quite right," said Catherine, "that the company ought to be aware of the matter, and since she has begun the telling of it, perhaps I may be permitted to finish it, for she has, I think, only the half she has guessed at, and the whole is a better story and a truer one, and you are all owed the truth, especially her grace, whom Lady Marbury fears has been imposed upon." She turned, not to the Countess, but to the room, and she told it simply, the way she had learned to tell dying people the truth they were owed, without heat and without shame. "My name is Catherine Mercer. I am the daughter of a gentleman of Fenwick, and when my father died and left us nothing, my brother took a commission in the army, and I followed him as far as I respectably could, which in the summer of the year 15 was to the city of Brussels, where the army gathered before the great battle. My brother was wounded in that battle and carried back to Brussels, and died 3 days later with his hand in mine. He was 23. He was the last of my family. After I buried him, I did not know what to do with myself, and so I went to where the wounded lay, for there were never enough hands, and I gave mine, and I learned in that terrible school the trade I have practiced ever since, the nursing of the gravely hurt and the dying." The room was utterly silent now. Catherine went on. "And on the 3rd day after I buried my brother, they brought me to a man they had given up on, an officer, a captain, wounded at the battle, 3 days in a fever that would not break, whom the surgeons had abandoned as past saving, and who needed only someone to sit with him so that he should not die alone. And I sat with him through the night and held him through the fever, and when near dawn he woke for a moment and said he was afraid and begged me not to let him die alone. I took the locket from my own neck, the locket holding the portrait of my mother who died when I was small, the dearest thing I owned in all the world, and I pressed it into his hand, and I told him to hold on to it and hold on to me and hold on until morning, and he held on, and the fever broke at dawn, and he lived." She paused. "I was called away before he was fully recovered in the chaos of that city, and we were parted, and I did not know his surname, nor his regiment, nor where he would be sent, and I never expected to see or hear of him again. And I told myself over the 5 years since that he had likely died of some later relapse, or recovered and gone home to a life with no room in it for the memory of a nurse. I never let myself imagine otherwise. I am not, by temperament, a woman who imagines happy things. Life has cured me of it." She turned now at last and looked at the Duke. "And then, a month ago, I was engaged to nurse the Dowager Duchess of Wynford, and I came to this house, and one day, mending a coat, I found, sewn into the lining over the place where a man's heart would beat, my mother's locket, the very one, the one I had given to a dying captain 5 years before in Brussels and never thought to see again. And so, I learned what Lady Marbury does not know, that the captain had lived and kept my mother over his heart for 5 years, and that he is the Duke of Wynford, and that he had searched for me those 5 years, and found me, and brought me here. I did not insinuate myself into this house, Lady Marbury. I was sought. I was sought for 5 years by a man who could not forget the woman who held him through the night he should have died, and who, it transpires, I had not forgotten either, though I had locked the memory away because it was too dear and too painful to bear looking at. That is the whole of the scandal you wish the company to know. A nurse who saved a dying soldier's life and gave him her mother's portrait to comfort him, and the soldier become a duke, who carried it over his heart for 5 years and crossed a kingdom to find her. You may judge for yourselves whether it is the sort of scandal that shames a great house, or the sort that honors it. She let that settle into the ringing silence, and then she finished quietly with the only thing that needed saying. As for angling for a coronet, Lady Marbury, I assure you I have done nothing of the kind, and I will tell you how you may be certain of it. I did not know when I came to this house that the Duke of Wynford was the captain from Brussels. I came to nurse a dying old woman for my wage, as I have nursed a great many dying people for my wage these 5 years, asking nothing and expecting nothing, for I learned long ago to expect nothing. I have angled for no coronet. I should be glad, frankly, to go on as I am, a useful woman earning her bread, and never be a duchess at all, for I have no taste for grandeur and no skill at it, and I am too old and too plain and too tired to learn. If His Grace and I have come to care for one another, it is not because either of us angled for anything. It is because we saved each other's lives once at the edge of the world, and then found each other again, and discovered that the people we are now like each other as well as the people we were then did. That is all. There is no scheme in it and no shame in it, and if you imagined a hired nurse could scheme a Duke of Wynford into anything against his will, then you understand neither dukes nor nurses, and least of all this one. It was the Dowager Duchess of Wynford who delivered the blow that ended it, for the old woman had listened to the whole of it from her chair, very still, and at the end of Catherine's telling there were tears standing in the sharp old eyes, and she lifted her frail voice into the silence with the absolute authority of the dying and the very great. "Imposed upon," said the Dowager. "Lady Marbury fears I have been imposed upon. Let me tell the company what has been imposed upon me in my 84th year in my own house at very nearly my deathbed. I have been imposed upon by a woman I have known these 30 years, who has come into my drawing-room at a party given for my pleasure, and tried to destroy the one person who has given me honest care and honest friendship in the last hard year of my life, and who, I now learn, also saved my grandson's life and gave him her dead mother's portrait to do it, which has quite undone me." She fixed the Countess with a look that had quelled 3 generations. "You wish to know whether I would be first to agree the nurse must go. Here is my answer, Honoria, and you may carry it home and chew on it. Miss Mercer will leave this house over my dead body, which, as everyone here is tactfully aware, will not be long in coming. And when it does, I intend to die a great deal easier, for knowing the woman who saved my grandson's life once is here to go on saving it, in all the quieter ways, for the rest of his. You, however, will leave tonight, and your scheming daughter with you, and you will not be received here again, and I shall make very sure every house worth entering in 3 counties knows precisely why. You came here to destroy a good woman to advance a vain one. You have instead, before all these witnesses, told the most beautiful love story in England against your own interest, and given me the joy of seeing my grandson look as he is looking now, which I had despaired of seeing again before I died. I thank you for it. Now get out of my house. The nurse stays, the schemers go, and anyone who disagrees may follow the Marburys to the door, for I have not many evenings left, and I do not propose to waste one in the company of fools who cannot tell a fortune hunter from a heroine." It was, by some distance, the most thoroughly the Countess of Marbury had ever been routed in her life, and there was no recovering from it. For when a dying dowager duchess declares a thing in her own drawing-room before the assembled gentry, the thing is declared, and the Countess gathered her white-faced daughter and her shredded dignity and left. And the story that went out from that evening was not the story she had meant to tell, but its glorious opposite. The story of the nurse who had saved a duke at Waterloo and been found again 5 years later with her mother's locket sewn over his heart, and had stood up before a drawing-room full of people and told the truth of it without shame, and been championed by a dying duchess and beloved by a duke. And the county, which had been prepared to be scandalized, found it infinitely more delicious to be enchanted instead, and enchanted it duly was, and Catherine Mercer, who had come to Wynford an anonymous hired nurse, was by the end of that week the most romantic figure in 3 counties, which she found absurd, and said so frequently, and was not attended to in the least. The Duke had not spoken through any of it after Catherine began. He had stood and listened and watched her win her own battle, and made no move to fight it for her, because he had understood, as he had been learning to understand her all that winter, that she did not need him to fight it for her, that she had been fighting her own battles alone for 5 years, and would not thank him for snatching this one, and that the most loving thing he could do was the hardest thing for a man of his rank and temper, which was to stand still and trust her, and let her be seen by the whole room to be exactly what she was, magnificent and unashamed. But when it was done, when the Marburys were gone and the guests dispersing in a buzz of delighted talk, and the dowager borne triumphantly off to bed, declaring it the best evening she had passed in a decade, the Duke of Wynford came at last to Catherine, where she stood by the window getting her breath back, and he did the thing he had been prevented from doing earlier, and he did not this time wait for a better moment, having learned that better moments do not reliably come and that the thing must simply be done. "I had a question to ask you," he said, "earlier, before the world came crashing in. I am going to ask it now in the wreckage, which is not how I planned it. But I find I cannot wait for the wreckage to clear, for I have wasted 5 years waiting for moments, and I am done with waiting." He took her hands, the nurse's hands, the hands that had held him through the fever, that he had searched 5 years to hold. "Catherine Mercer, you saved my life once with these hands and a locket and the words 'hold on.' You have spent the winter saving it again in all the quieter ways, the ways my grandmother named. And I find I do not want to be saved by you only now and then, in crises, but every ordinary day for the rest of my life, and I want to spend that life saving yours in return, in all the same quiet ways, pouring back into you some fraction of all you have poured out into others and never let anyone pour back. I am not asking the dying captain's nurse to marry the Duke out of an old debt. The debt is real, but it is not why. I am asking the living woman, whom I have come to know this winter and love better than I have ever loved anything, to marry the living man, who is not grand or easy or unmarked, but who is, he promises you, entirely and permanently yours. Marry me, Catherine, not because you saved me, because we found each other twice against all the world, and I should be the greatest fool in England to let the world part us a second time. Marry me. Say yes. I have held on for 5 years, exactly as you told me to. Let the morning come." And Catherine Mercer, who had locked away the worst and most precious summer of her life for 5 years because hope was a luxury that only made the falling harder, who had taught herself to expect nothing, ask for nothing, want nothing for herself, because everything she had ever loved had been taken from her, stood in the wreckage of a routed scandal with her hands in the hands of the man she had pulled back from death, and found that she had, against all her hard-won caution, run entirely out of reasons to be careful. "You said, that night in Brussels," she said, and her voice was not steady at all now, the last of the composed mass gone for good, "that you could not hold on by yourself. It was the only wholly lucid thing you said in all those hours. And I told you that you were not by yourself, that I had got you, that we would get you to morning together. And we did." She drew a shaking breath. "I have been holding on by myself for 5 years, Edmund, since my brother died, asking no one to help me because there was no one, and because I had learned that to lean is to be let fall. And I am so tired of it. I did not know how tired until this winter, until you began, quietly, when you thought I did not notice, pouring things back into me, sending up the books I liked, remembering how I take my tea, standing still tonight and trusting me to win my own battle. No one has poured anything back into me in 5 years. I had forgotten it was even possible, and I find—" Her voice broke entirely. "I find I want to do what I told you to do that night, and hold on to someone and be held on to, and get to morning together, every morning, for the rest of my life. So yes, Edmund, I will marry you, not because I saved you, because you have saved me right back all winter from the worst thing that ever happened to me, not my brother's death nor my father's ruin, but the slow closing over after, the teaching of myself to want nothing and need no one. And you have undone all of it gently until here I am wanting everything and needing you, which terrifies me, and which I would not trade for all the safe-guarded nothing in the world. Yes, I will marry you. Let the morning come. I am done holding on by myself." And the Duke of Wynford drew the nurse who had saved him into his arms at last, the woman he had searched 5 years to find and found, the hands he had searched 5 years to hold and held. And there, in the wreckage of the routed scandal, with her mother's locket between them, over both their hearts now, the dying captain and the grieving nurse who had become a living duke and a living woman finished, after 5 years, the thing they had begun in a candle-lit sick-room 1,000 miles away, and the morning came, as Catherine had promised it would, and went on coming, every morning after, for the rest of their lives. The morning after the rooted scandal, before the household was properly stirring, Catherine did a thing she told no one about, not even the Duke until much later. She went, alone, to the portrait gallery and stood before the blank space on the wall that had drawn her so often in those first uneasy weeks, the empty rectangle of slightly darker paper where a portrait had clearly hung and been taken down, for she had understood now what it was, and she wanted to see it understood. She had asked Mrs. Beck, the housekeeper, about it once in the early days, and got an evasive answer. She knew the truth now from the Duke. The portrait that had hung there was of his elder brother, the previous Duke of Wynford, dead these 3 years, and the Duke, in the strange shut grief of his accession, had had it taken down, not out of any lack of love, but out of too much of it, because he could not bear to walk the gallery and meet his dead brother's painted eyes every day, could not bear the daily reminder that he wore a title that should have been his brother's, lived a life his brother should have lived, had survived where another good man had not. The blank space was a wound, exactly like the blank space the war had left in him, the place where the men he had led ought still to have been, and Catherine, standing before it in the early light, understood at last why the unease of her first weeks had drawn her here, to this blank rectangle, again and again, for she had been, all unknowing, recognizing a kindred grief, the grief of the survivor, the blank space where a loved one ought to be, which she carried herself in the shape of James and her father and her mother, and every dying soul she had eased to a door she could not follow them through. She heard his step behind her. He had risen early, too, and come looking, and found her there. "You took your brother down," she said, not turning, "because you could not bear to be reminded that you lived and he did not. The same reason you tried to die in Brussels, the same wound. You have been walking past this blank space for 3 years, the way you walked through those 5, surviving, and not forgiving yourself for it." She turned to him. "Edmund, I have spent 5 years among the dying, and I have learned one thing about survival that I think you have not let yourself learn, and I am going to give it to you now, as a wedding gift. It is this: the dead do not want the blank space. I have sat with a great many people at the very end and heard their last clear words, and not one of them, not one in 5 years, has ever spent a dying wish resenting the living who would outlast them. They want the opposite. They want us to live, hard and well and fully, in their stead, with the life they are losing. That is the one thing the dying ask of the living, over and over. Live. Be happy. Do not waste on grieving me the life I would give anything to keep. Your brother does not want this blank space, any more than your soldiers want you half wishing you had died with them. They want their portraits on the wall and their survivor living gladly beneath them. I know, because I have asked them hundreds of times at the very threshold, and the answer is always the same. She took his hand. So here is my wedding gift, the only one worth anything. Put your brother back. Hang the portrait. Walk the gallery and meet his eyes and let them be glad eyes, glad to see you living the life he lost, and for that is how they all look at the end, at the ones who will outlive them. Stop grieving in blank spaces. Live, Edmund. Marry me and put your brother back on the wall and live gladly under his eyes, for him and for your soldiers and for my brother and for every soul we have both watched go through the door. For the truest honoring of the dead is not a blank space and a survivor's guilt. It is a full life, lived gladly, by the ones they loved enough to want it for. That is the gift. Take it and put your brother back. And the Duke of Wynford stood before the blank space on the wall with the nurse's hand in his and wept, for the first time since Brussels himself. And within the month the portrait of the previous duke hung once more in the gallery, restored to its place, and beneath it, in time, the new Duke and Duchess of Wynford would walk arm in arm on 100 ordinary evenings, and glance up at the painted eyes, and find them, exactly as Catherine had promised, glad. For they had both learned, the nurse from her deathbeds and the soldier from his nurse, the hardest and truest lesson the dead have to teach the living, which is that grief honors no one, and a glad, full life honors everyone, and that the way to carry the lost is not in a blank space, but in a heart that goes on, deliberately, joyfully, living the life they would have wanted, holding on to the light they had to let go of, for their sake, as much as one's own. They were married in the early summer, quietly, for the dowager could not have borne a grand affair, and would not hear of being left out of any affair at all, and so the wedding came to her, in a sense, held in the small chapel at Wynford with the old woman carried down in a great chair to see it, fierce and frail and weeping without the least shame, having held on exactly as she had announced she would, to see her grandson settled before she died. She died that autumn, peacefully, in her sleep, with Catherine's hand in hers, for Catherine nursed her to the very end and would not have been anywhere else, and her last clear words, a few days before, had been to Catherine, and they were these: "I am dying easy, child, which I did not expect to, and it is your doing, for I have seen him safe, and seen him happy, and seen the locket come home, and a person can let go of a great deal once she has seen the ones she loves held by someone who will not let them fall. You will not let him fall. I knew it the first day when you told me the truth about my own dying. Go on telling him the truth all your lives and holding on, and you will do very well, the both of you. Now, I am tired. Sit with me and do not let go of my hand, and we will get me to morning together as you got him. Hold on, child. Just sit and hold on." And Catherine had sat and held on and got her to morning and to a few more mornings after, and when at last the old woman did let go, it was gently and unafraid, with her hand in the hand of the nurse who had become her granddaughter, and that, Catherine thought afterward, was perhaps the truest measure of the whole strange story, that a thing begun in the easing of one death had grown in 5 years into the easing of another, and into a marriage, and into a life, the brutal, tender trade of holding on transformed at last from a way of surviving grief into a way of building joy. They did one thing more, the Duke and the new Duchess of Wynford, in the years that followed, and it grew directly out of all the rest, and out of a July in Brussels neither of them would ever forget. They built, endowed, and Catherine herself oversaw a house for the nursing of soldiers, the used-up men of the long wars whom the grateful nation had thanked and then forgotten, and their widows and orphans besides, a place where such a man might come and be cared for and not die alone and afraid, where there were always enough hands, and the hands were kind, and no one in extremity was ever left to hold on by himself. They did not name it for themselves. They named it for a lieutenant named James Mercer, 23, who had died of his wounds in Brussels with his sister's hand in his. And over the door, at Catherine's wish, they carved 2 words that made the Duke and Duchess glance at one another every time they passed beneath them with a look no one else could read. The 2 words were, "Hold on." So bank your fire now and turn your lamp low and let the dark draw gentle and close. 2 people held each other through the worst night of the world, at the very edge of death, and were parted, and carried the memory of it for 5 long years apart, each believing they alone had carried it. And then they were given, against all the odds the hard world allows, the rarest gift of all, which is a second meeting in the ordinary light, and the courage at last to hold on. And somewhere tonight, by some other fire, in some house I shall never look upon, you have kept them company to the end of their story, and I am glad of it, more glad than I can say, and I should dearly love to know where in the world you have been listening from. Sleep well. There will be another fire and another story when next the candles are lit.